In today's lesson, what we're going to do is continue to work with our aperture, and this time we're going to do it to get a really wide or deep depth of field. And this is where everything in your picture is sharp front to back. This is really useful for those of you that are landscape photographers and want to take outdoor scenery pictures and that sort of thing. This is what you're going to use this all the time, so it's hugely important. And in any event, everybody takes ultimately vacation pictures, sunset pictures, and stuff like that, and that's where you're really going to use this. So that's what we're going to do. Now, remember that we're working with the aperture, and I should have mentioned this in the last video, but I forgot, is that I have an old lens here, and let me turn it so you can see it, and you can see the aperture, and it gets large. That's what we did last time to create the shallow depth of field, and then we make it smaller, and the smaller you make it, the deeper the depth of field. Usually your lens is going to go to something like an f/22 will be the smallest aperture. So remember again, the larger the number, the smaller the aperture, but the wider the depth of field. And that's what we're going to be working with. So I'm using an old film lens because this won't really work on modern lenses because it's operated by your camera. This is an older lens and it actually has a ring on it. That's why I keep showing you that. Anyway, that's what we're going to do. Now, you can probably see from that the trade-off that's involved here is that as we make this aperture smaller, obviously you're really restricting the amount of light that's coming into your camera. And so as you make it smaller to get this deeper or wider depth of field, then now you're really clamping down on the light. Your only options are going to be to use a much longer shutter speed than you might otherwise use, or to raise the ISO quite a bit, or both. That leads us to the keys to success for using your small apertures, and this will help you with today's assignment when we get to that. The first thing I want to talk about is tripods. This seems like a good time to sort of introduce you to the subject because, as I mentioned, when you use this small aperture, the light has to come from somewhere, and usually it comes from a longer shutter speed. Like I said, very often you use these small apertures to make everything sharp front to back in like a landscape context or something like that. And in those cases, nothing's moving. So you can use as long a shutter speed as you want, provided that you can keep the camera steady. In other words, that there's nothing moving in front of you that would become blurry if you use a long shutter speed. So you can do it, you just need to keep the camera stable. How do you do that? Well, enter the tripod. So I'll just grab a tripod here and we can talk about this a little bit. Now the first question you might have is what kind of tripod should you get? And the reality is I'm not very particular about this. There's two reasons for that. One is that I feel like tripods have improved a lot and gotten better. There was always this old saying that you could, with tripods, you wanted one that was stable, light, and inexpensive, and you could have any two of those you want, but not all three. I'm not sure that's true anymore, and for two reasons. Number one, they make these really cool travel tripods that don't cost that much money. Two brands I know of is Manfrotto makes, I think it's their Be-Free models, and MePhoto makes three models, their Backpacker, Road Tripper, and Globetrotter models. They pack up real small, so they're easy to carry around. They're pretty light. They don't cost a lot, and they're stable. They'll hold pretty much any camera and lens setup that's on the market, so check those out. Another thing that's changed so that I don't become as particular about tripods is that cameras and lenses have gotten smaller and lighter. If you're someone that uses a mirrorless camera, then you can get away with a cheaper tripod. You've always got to have a tripod that's stable. I mean, if you don't have that, you don't have anything. It's worse than useless. But as light as cameras are getting these days, you can often get away with one that is cheaper and that I think in the past would have been considered not worth using. But anyway, go ahead and feel free not to spend a fortune on your tripod, but do get one because this is how you keep the camera steady. Okay, so the first key to success is really just to get your tripod and use it. I'm not going to walk through using it, and frankly, there's not much to them. You simply put your camera on the top attach it there, usually with a quick release plate, set your legs, and there you go. Now, one thing I do want to mention about tripods is that you can see I have it set up here to its full height, okay? And one thing I didn't do that I don't want you to do either is manipulate the center column. You can see it creates instability, and you don't want that. The whole idea here is that because you're using this small aperture, you're going to offset that by a longer shutter speed. And so your camera needs to be perfectly still during that time. You can't have any vibrations or anything, so make sure everything's good and tight and fixed up, and you don't want this center column up that could be unstable. The second thing related to height that I wanted to mention is I have it at full height here, and that's very convenient because I can look right through it and see and don't have to scrunch over or do anything. But don't get too attached to that. Is that, you know, if you're taking pictures at normal times of day at normal heights, then you have a normal picture, and you do not want normal pictures, right? You want different pictures. You want creative pictures. And in the landscape context, very often what you're going to find is that pictures look great if you have your tripod really low to the ground and get behind something. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But when you're using your tripod, don't be afraid to use it as low as you can and not just be standing here comfortably looking at it in eye level. So that's another key for you. The final thing I wanted to mention when you're using this is that you don't want to be touching the camera to take the picture, or you might be introducing some vibration, okay? There's two ways to get around that. One is to get what's called a remote shutter release, and they have them that plug into the camera somewhere, or they have ones that are wireless. Either way is fine, and they don't cost a ton. You can get them, the wired ones, really cheap for like 10 bucks. And you can spend, you know, up to about 80, 90 bucks on these things if you really want to get crazy. But so they don't cost a fortune, but that's a good way. Another good way, though, if you don't want to spend anything, is to use the timer on your camera. So rather than pressing the shutter button, you can set the timer so that when you press the shutter button, it'll wait 2 seconds is what I usually set, and then take the picture. That way, when it goes off, you're not touching anything. Your hands are completely off it, and you're in good shape. There'd be no vibrations. Anyway, these are important things when you're using the longer exposure times that we're probably going to be using here with the smaller aperture. The second thing I want to talk about with respect to your deep depth of field is focal length. Remember I mentioned in the shallow depth of field that the more you zoomed in, the easier time you were going to have creating a shallow depth of field. Now, the converse of that is also true. A wide angle lens, like you usually use in landscape photography and stuff like that, then creates a situation where it's actually hard to create a shallow depth of field. That means it's easy to have a very deep or wide depth of field. What that means to you is that you don't necessarily need to crank down the aperture on your lens to f/22. And in fact, there's a lot of people that'll tell you that's a really bad idea to do anyway. There's a concept in this world called diffraction. Diffraction is a softness that comes into your pictures when you use the smallest apertures there. It's always present. You can't get around it. It's in every lens. It's just sort of a law of physics or something like that. It just has to do with the way light moves. So anyway, a lot of people avoid the smallest apertures because they don't want any of that diffraction in their pictures. I would tell you not to really get too wrapped up in it, but it is something to think about. Most landscape photographers I know try to keep their photos around f/11 very often, and I think f/16 would be considered a maximum by then. Now, you may think to yourself then, well, how do you get the really deep depth of field without doing that? And the answer is that if you're going wide angle, you don't need to. Because again, remember, zooming in makes it easier to get a shallow depth of field. Zooming out makes it much easier to get a deep depth of field. So you don't necessarily need to crank it all the way up. The next thing is this question of where do you focus? What is the most important thing to make sure is sharp? Because as much as you work with this, there'll always be a little bit of fall off as you get away from your focus point. So where should you focus? Now, there's two answers to that. One is if you have a subject, focus on the subject. Just do that every time. But then two, If there's not a definite subject, like if it's just a sort of a big scene in front of you, sort of a coastal scene or something like that, or a big sunset from a vista, then a good rule of thumb is to focus about a third of the way into the picture. Don't focus all the way. What you're going to find is that things just look better if the foreground is sharper than the background. The viewer will forgive the background being slightly unsharp, more so than they will the foreground, so it just looks better. So a rule of thumb associated with trying to get these deep depths of field is that make sure that your foreground is the sharpest thing in your shot. So use those things when you do your assignment, and I think that'll really help you get a cool shot. So with that, let's get into today's assignment and talk about it. What I want you to do is capture a style of picture that's referred to as the Grand Scenic Landscape. That might sound like I want you to go to the Grand Canyon or Zion National Park and get this picture, and that's not what I'm talking about. It's simply a style of picture that's used a lot in the landscape context. And what happens is this, or what you do is this. You get right behind something. That something can be anything. Something on the ground. It can be a thing, it can be a pattern, it can be anything. And you'll get right behind it, and so it will be your foreground or your subject. And then I want you to capture that shot and then have the background to be sharp as well. Okay? That's going to do two things for you. Number one, it's sort of a real challenge for creating a deep depth of field. In other words, it's showing that you can do it. If you can have that thing right in front of you, if you can have that sharp and your background sharp, then you have mastered the wide or deep depth of field and you know how to do it. So that's good. The second thing is this, is that for your outdoor pictures or your landscape pictures, you're going to find this technique works great. It seems totally counterintuitive. If you see this great background with the mountains and the sky, you think, oh my God, that's the shot. And maybe it is. But so often, putting something in the foreground, getting right behind it, and then having that background around it just creates an awesome picture. So go ahead and give that a try. You can do it anywhere. You can do it in the park by your house. You can do it near a river. You can do it wherever. So you don't have to go running around looking for, some wonderful landscape. But do give it a try. Just make sure you get something in the foreground that you're focused on, that is sharp, and that you keep the background totally sharp. Do that, then you'll have really gotten the deep or wide depth of field from the small apertures that we've been talking about here. And with that, we will have then concluded our aperture stuff, and we'll move on to our next and final exposure control, which is shutter speed, and we'll do that in the next video.